أهلا فيكم في هذه الندوة الصباحية ضمن ملتقى أريج
This morning session, the ARIJ Forum 2022, this morning session that addresses when a vest and a helmet are not enough. Today we're living in a confused world with so many crises, conflict areas, tension, clashes. The journalists and those who work in the academic and journalism sectors are the ones who pay the bill, pay the bigger bill, the blood bill, the one that is the highest among all sectors. If we go to recent statistics by UN and international institutions, we would have found that the figures are on the rise. We're talking about hundreds of journalists who have been killed since 1992 until now. It's more than 1,800 male and female journalists in various areas of the world. Now there are journalists being targeted at places with stability. We're talking about the European continent. 10 journalists have been killed in the past 5 years. If we speak about Ukraine, with the military clashes across the country, we're talking about journalists who work in areas, safe and secure areas. That's why we ask again, is a vest and a helmet enough to protect the journalists? In the ARIJ network, I would be speaking in less than 2 minutes, and then we would be welcoming our guests from the different areas taking part in this forum. In the ARIJ network, we talked about 5 trends of security and protection, journalists, security and protection. First one is the professional security regarding physical security. Any at tensions, at areas of tension and disputes. The other one is the mental health and security, what the journalist is subjected to from the trauma. The third one is the digital security. Today in this world, the entire world is based on the communication, digital platforms, whereby the journalists access, whether for work or for social media communication, they are always subjected to being hacked and subjected to cyber attacks. The fourth one, we're talking about the legal security. When a journalist does work at an area, whether an area of dispute or stability, he or she would be still facing legal issues due to the courts. They are being sent to court or tried and arrested, detained. The last one that ARIJ network addressed this year and that had a scope is the professional security. How can a journalist protect himself? How to and also maintain their work sustainably and with more stability through their curriculum vitae. This morning we would be addressing all these issues. I'm honored to host Evelyn Orchestra, who is the Director of Policies and Advocacy at the FPU. Evelyn is in Amman. We have Maali Hazaz, coordinator, donors coordinator, and journalists safety in UNESCO. Mr. Munir Zarour, the Director of Policies and Programs at the International Consortium of Journalists that is based in Brussels, combining more than a number of journalists. Welcome all. Our distinguished guests, I'm pleased to be with you in this session. Evelyn, when we say, or maybe if I start with Maali, such figures, such shocking figures that we read and we see, until when this reality would continue? Is it true that a vest and a helmet are insufficient to protect journalists? Thank you. Yes, figures in the Arab world. I've done a presentation on figures on the ground to compare the different areas, the Arab world and other areas. I don't know if you can have the presentation on the screen, and if anybody is interested can take the presentation that includes all the information and figures, even for additional information if you're interested to know. As you all know, the UNESCO mandate, I added it because for those, we work on protection of journalists within a bigger scope, which is the freedom of expression and access to information. All of these are rights. Of course, journalists are always at risk as they seek to find information and to provide information to the public, as well as the freedom of expression. That is the main factor. Regarding the figures, I'm trying to see, it's difficult to see the screen.
Can I switch to English because it's a bit easier because I could just follow with the.
She wants to switch to English.
UNESCO actually works on different areas, in a sense, to protect journalists or to provide a safer environment for journalists. One of the areas we work in is actually the monitoring and tracking of killings, because when you know and you can identify the high rate of killings, and later on you'll also see impunity, it is one factor that would help us all to push forward and to use that to protect journalists further. So when you look at the numbers here, this is the number of journalists killed by region. And you can see here, and this is actually only covering a certain period, which is 22-21, and you can see the numbers. And there's also the percentage. But if we look closer, we have a more comprehensive study. And this one is actually covering a bit of a bigger, like a longer period. And you can see here as well, you have the status of impunities of those killings of journalists in percentages. And you can also see per region. Now, the safety of journalists is, again, as we say, it is a long-standing challenge in the region. We all know that, and that's why we're all here, which is, again, the deadliest worldwide, unfortunately. According to UNESCO's recent Director General report, and I advise you to seek it, you can search it on the net, and you can find more information for different reports. For this region, it has been the highest number of journalist killings of any other region in the world, reaching 380 cases and only resolving 7 cases since the monitoring process in 2006. Now, the region also has the highest level of regional impunity, with 98% of cases that remain unsolved. It is important to highlight, nevertheless, that the majority of these killings took place in situations of armed conflict or war situation, which increases the difficulty to prosecute those crimes. Now, because everyone blames everyone else, right? Now, the rate compared to Asia and Pacific, 89%, and for Africa, 82%, Latin America, 78%, and Central Asian Europe, you have 55%. Now, one of other ways that UNESCO works also to protect journalists is supporting safety mechanisms. Under the multi-donor program that I coordinate, we have a number of countries, including few in the Arab region as well, where we've been supporting a creation of safety mechanisms where we can, it's national, where we also include national counterparts. And just for some examples in the region, we've created a monitoring mechanism in Tunisia, together with the 2 other organizations, with OTHR and CNGT, which is a national organization, a digital protection platform in Iraq, and a continental digital platform on the safety of journalists across African continent. And I'm saying that because we have a number of Arab countries that are already part of the continent. Now, the one in Africa is one of the best examples because it really includes all of the African countries. It is a monitoring mechanism. And if any is interested, I can meet you later. I can give you my email, or you can take it from ARIJ. I can send you also the link to that website because it is updated and it has information constantly. Another area that UNESCO has embarked on in the last couple of years is mostly to protect journalists through legal support. which is through the Global Media Defense Fund. And here, maybe some of you would be interested because there's a call for proposal that is launched throughout the year. And the one upcoming is the first quarter of next year. Now, the Global Media Defense Fund was established only in 2019, and it aims at addressing this gap, among other things, of the lack of professional journalist investigations. And here comes ARIJ and all of you investigative journalists, because you play a huge role in also investigating those crimes against other journalists. So UNESCO seeks partners, non-profit organizations, in the undertaking of projects at the national, regional, and global levels to enhance their freedom by supporting investigative journalists and enhancing the safety of those conducting the line of work. Another area is training and cooperation with other organizations. I'm not going to go into detail. You can see numbers, you can see examples of work we've been doing, but what we have been trying to do is to work with various partners that play various roles. It is true that we train journalists, and through this project with ARIJ, Amman 360, and with IFJ, we've done a variety of trainings, of capacity building, of providing safety clinics for journalists, a hotline, but we also train other people who are responsible for enhancing this environment, which, like the judges, for example. You can see here numbers of how many judicial operators we have trained in the past years, including the Arab region. We had in June this year a huge regional conference bringing together around 40 judges from 10 Arab countries. And you would be surprised to see how eager they are to play a role in that. You know, usually you'd be surprised. You would think, we need to enhance their knowledge about these things. But you'd see they're ready and they are eager. So we're translating that into national actions later on. You can see that we're also working with police, with the law enforcement agents, because a lot of times, again, we see journalists being attacked by the police during demonstrations or whatever is the reason. Whenever there's a journalist covering, police just immediately thinks that they have to stop them, that they're part of, they don't understand their role. So we're also doing a lot of trainings in a lot of countries with the police officers, bringing together journalists later on so that we would let them both understand each other's role. And it worked in a lot of countries. We see them later leaving with a better understanding. And we've seen a much lower, less attacks and less issues during elections and those countries and during demonstrations and so on. I'm almost done. Just to mention a few, we've also consultations. I think most of you either were involved or heard about them. That we have already passed 10 years, right, under the UN Plan of Action for the Safety of Journalists. So UNESCO and partners thought it is best to sit together in different regions, and we held regional consultations around the globe, including the Arab region, where we wanted to see where we're at after 10 years. What have we accomplished? Where are still the gaps? And if there are any new trends? So this was done, and then the results from all these consultations were gathered in Austria during International Day Impunity, and we discussed them, and we have an outcome document. And again, for anyone needing any of the things I mentioned, please let me know. We have this outcome document with all the recommendations, including the regional results. So later on, what we're doing now, translating all these regional recommendations into action plans, identifying what's being done so that these recommendations would be actually met, and where there's a gap, and identifying who will play what role.
Sorry, Maali, we have just 1 minute for you.
1 minute. I'll just maybe mention, again, this is all about the recommendations. Maybe I think this is the last one. Maybe you can look at some of the recommendations that were mostly for the Arab region, but also some are shared. It includes journalist training adapted to each country's unique context, because we know one size doesn't fit all. Establishing a safe, secure mechanism for journalists. We're doing this in some places, especially for women. But again, we have to make sure that we have a mechanism, a safety mechanism everywhere in terms of monitoring, protection, and so on. Promoting rule of law, again, and independent international investigation bodies. And you can see the rest. We're also working on policy level. We're trying, as UNESCO as an intergovernmental organization, to work with the member states to change the laws. And if there are existing laws, to make sure they're according to international standards, so that we can guarantee a safer environment for journalists. So that's all. Thank you.
شكرا معالي. يعني لخفض هذه الارقام ولضبط استهداف الصحفيين، ايضا اتى مشروع امان 360 الذي تم بالتنسيق بين
In order to reduce these figures, this was done in cooperation between the Denmark and UNESCO and a partnership with the ARIJ and ARIJ. We issued a number of short videos that use animation in order to speak about the professional safety of, and also we implemented more than 74 physical safety and integrity for journalists who do investigative journalism. And even before 2 days of holding the conference, there was something new in the safety world, in the Arab region, in order to develop the idea of risk assessment model. Because most of the organizations that are here, they deal with risk assessment model and mechanisms for assessing the risks in a very relaxant way, be it stable or conflict area. So why did you go to this region, this area, and what is the logic that you follow in supporting the professional safety for journalists?
Thank you.
So I'm part of Free Press Unlimited, which is an international press freedom organization based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And we've been working in the last year very specifically on impunity for crimes against journalists. We just heard about, I think, this staggering number of impunity here in the region, 98% of attacks going without achieving justice. And we believe that working on this can be very effective because there are several ways we can do this. I'm leading a project called A Safer World for the Truth, which is a cooperation between FPU, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and RSF. And what we found is actually by doing investigations into cold cases of journalist murders, we can find new evidence even 10 years later. So we have finalized 5 investigations all across the world. Also looking at this region, actually, we've done an investigation in Kurdistan, and we've organized a People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists, which is also a way to create accountability where it's not being served by the states as of now. So during these investigations, we look at talking to people, witnesses, and gathering evidence, which has not been done properly 10 years before. So, for instance, when we looked at the case of at the People's Tribunal, which we organized, which is a grassroots justice initiative, which obviously this is not what you want to be doing in the end, because these are states that need to take up these cases. This is the legal system that needs to be taking up these cases, which doesn't happen. So what we did is we organized this tribunal, and we brought together, we cooperated with the Permanent People's Tribunal based in Rome. And we looked at 3 specific cases. So we held 3 case hearings, including one on Syria, on the case of Nabil Asharbashi, who was a Syrian citizen journalist, and who was, as many other journalists, killed in jail. And obviously there's no opportunity for justice. There's no way we can reopen this case in Syria. But by assembling all this evidence, we had a 2-day case hearing in The Hague, and we had all the witnesses present. We had, family, colleagues talking about the issue. We gave them a platform, their day in court. And I think that's very important to show there are alternatives when states are not living up to their obligations. And there's people that can tell these stories. What we also see, I recently finalized a research into impunity, and what we see is very important, and I think that's crucial for the people here in the room. Public attention is one of the key things in solving cases of journalist murders, and I think also in attacks on murders, which happen way too often. So if you look at, we in the opening session of this conference, we saw many things on the case of Shireen Abu Akleh. And what we see very often is that, this is tracked from the start, but it's not tracked consistently afterwards. There's a really big role to play for journalists in tracking, these official investigations, what happens, and follow this, and keeping also this public attention by people, because that's very important. If you want to keep pressure on these cases, you need people to care about these cases. And I think in this region, it might be harder because there are more attacks in comparison to, you spoke about also the murders that took place in Europe.
Sorry, Evelyn, could you please be close with the mic?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course.
Meer dichter naar de mic.
Yeah, of course. You spoke about, these cases of journalists murdered in Europe, and there's a really big shock effect because it doesn't happen very often. So you have the people, caring about it. You have the media covering it all the time. So there's a really clear pressure on the justice system to deliver on these cases, which I think we need to be aware of the fact how crucial that is, also in cases happening across the world. We see in the 5% of cases that have been solved, where there has been full justice, there was a really big media campaign around these cases. There were people demanding accountability time after time and not giving up on these cases. And I think we need to be hopeful also that, you know, for instance, the case I discussed about the Nabil Ashrabashi, which we took up in the People's Tribunal, there is no real, you know, there's no real chance for justice in Syria now. But if we don't assemble the evidence, we can't have accountability later on, and we can't have a change in the end. So, I mean, it's not the most hopeful story we can tell, but I believe there's a lot of steps we can take to solve these really bad impunity rates also now. And I believe we can, you know, if we work together, if there's journalists around the world covering these issues and maintaining the attention on it, there's a real, you know, reason to be optimistic about the change that will follow, because we've seen that in these cases that have been solved.
يعني تحدثت عن المرحومة شيرين أبو عاقلة. أيضا نحن
spoke about Shireen Abu Aqli, and we remember Peter Hadibest, who was assassinated in Europe. He was assassinated after doing investigative reports, and 3 suspects were arrested. Munir, if I go, do we have 2 different realities in the Arab region as related to the safety and security of journalists, since you work through more than 120 offices in the world? Do you have 2 different realities, or is it just the same?
جميعا شكرا جزيلا لهذه الفرصة. سعيد إنه
Good morning, and I'm really glad to meet our colleagues. Thanks, ARIJ. The ARIJ is the international unionist organization that represents most of the journal syndicates around the world, 120 almost in 145 countries. The safety of journalists as our approach, and basically it is the responsibility of the employer. This is our approach. There is something that is called the due diligence that every organization, they need to take care of that. Unfortunately, in the Arab region, when we started working on professional safety, the awareness of employers towards the safety of their staff compared to was not so advanced as it is elsewhere in the world, which has to do with the strength and efficiency of unionist work. At the AFJ work and the international unionist work were mandated for so many years in within the AFJ. In the year 2020, the ILO Convention 120 is related to combating violence in work environment. This became implemented or in effect last year. Unfortunately, until now, none of the Middle East, Arab world countries, none of them, these countries have ratified this convention. So we hope that to shed light on the failure of Arab countries to approve and accede this convention that focuses on the responsibility of employers in providing protection to their workers. You can stop me any moment. The physical integrity situation of journalists in the Arab region, as you know, through 3 decades, the region was leading other regions in the world in terms of the amount of physical assaults and attacks against journalists and murder. Since the 1990s, around 20 were killed in Algeria, 60 in Palestine, 44 journalists were killed in Yemen, 408 in Iraq, 465 in Syria. So it is shocking and terrifying. In the last 4 years, there was a very tangible drop in the number of journalists killed in the region, although every individual case should be considered as horrific and catastrophic. Because this year, the AFJ documented the death of 4 journalists killed in the region, 1 in Palestine, one in Yemen and 2 in Syria. We are still considering another 2 cases, one in Yemen and one in Syria, to verify the circumstances and whether if it is related to their professional work. Munir, we were speaking in a while before we started that we always say that if it rains with the Soviets, here we carry umbrellas. So for how long are we going to keep reactionists instead of being proactivists? When they start speaking about it in Europe, here we start. So you said that the organizations, they need to deepen this culture of physical integrity. In less than 3 minutes, please. The media organization's responsibility is to take care of the physical integrity of their staff. These organizations in the region, in general, can be of 3 types. One of them is owned by the state, one for the private sector, and others mainly supported by donors, so donors who support journalism. They invest 0 budget in protecting the physical integrity of their journalists. That is the government. The private sector, they say we don't have budgets. So now we are left with the donor-funded organizations. The ARIJ sent letters to most of the donors that we believe there should be a special budget allocated for the safety of journalists in every grant you give, psychological and physical and health integrity of journalists. I believe this is the duty of the donors to allocate a budget line or allocations for this, which can only be used for this objective. This is for developing the interest in physical safety and making it a basic media work. What you mentioned is extremely important, the issue of feeling like there are worries about the amount of intimidation and against journalism. It's not only journalism, by the way, it is about the civil society, which is on the decline. This is true in Europe, in the US, the ascension of the right wing. I believe in the last 10 years, there is no decline in the civil society. And the fact it's on the contrary, is exploding in terms of its expansion. But there are pressures from all areas. So here we have unprecedented expansion. So not diagnosing our reality in this area, this leads us to lose this momentum or in integrating other factors to increase our strength.
UNESCO celebrates the International Day of Journalism and the impunity and also the increase of crimes against journalists. And we know that killers in most of the times are known. Are these anniversaries or occasions, why can't we find those who have been tried for killing or assaulting a journalist? The lack of trials would increase the number of crimes and would give the attacker to do whatever they do, and also with impunity. UNESCO cannot play the role of the judiciary, of course, but as I have said before, we have more than one aspect. We work with the judges. We said we're working with the attackers who are usually, or sometimes the security forces, but also by the member states. I think we have more than one. We have the silent diplomacy, which we can't, excuse me, because sometimes we don't do naming and shaming. when we have discussions with the member states, it's always behind closed doors. But nowadays, it's not celebrations. Even when we do global events, the global conference or the public conference, we have each of us celebrating or having their own events. And these are basically if there are figures, attacks, to announce them, to also make them known for the public. In every occasion, we have the declaration. Maybe I would switch to English.
We always have some sort of declarations or some sort of statements where we have all the member states that are attending and they're there to commit to it. I know you could say it's just ink on paper, but when they sign and they're committed to it, we have two components. First, we can follow up more on that. They have showed commitment, therefore they have to respond to it. There's going to be next year another event. There's going to be the DG report. There's going to be this and that. But also through the multi-donor program that I mentioned, which I coordinate and which has been working, implementing since 2017. And we have a number of donors that are supporting it, including Sweden, Netherlands, Norway, Iceland. We have a lot of countries who are like-minded, who want to support and enhance this safety. What we do is when we identify those countries that have committed and signed those declarations, we dedicate through our offices enough budget and support and technical support to make sure that we make them live up to this. So we go and we work with these countries to revise the laws, to follow up on cases of impunity, to create national mechanisms and to be committed to even be part of this mechanism, to actually be, the government has to not only, it's not approving it, but to make sure that it's actually working. When there's a monitoring, the government is responsible for those numbers of attacks and so on. So we work on those levels. I think UNESCO, sometimes it has an added value. A lot of people tell me you have them as member states. Maybe it's on the contrary, because we have access to those member states. It is true, we cannot go twist someone's arm, but when you work with those member states and each time they even meet in headquarters, they are questions and they know they have to respond. And when they are committed, through these agreements, and they have to live up to it. I know we still are far off. We have a lot of attacks around the globe, but at least it's a step forward. And we can, as UNESCO, at least play that role that no one else can actually work directly with the governments and with the member states. So again, these events are not celebrations per se. Yeah. They are, again, as you say, commemorations, but to put more of extra pressure. And another good thing is that when you have like-minded donors, like for example, the Netherlands, during one of the recent World Breastfeeding Days, has committed 7 million euros, 3.5 for us and 3.5 for OHCHR, to put more emphasis and work further to support and enhance, a safer environment, to provide a safer environment. So also in terms of other donors committing and putting more funding and more commitment and pressure, it's also another way forward. So these events, again, that's what we use them mostly for. In the region, what I invite all the colleagues who get funding through the multi-donor program to hold these events is to actually make sure that if they're working with the government, to use that event to put them there on the spots. And then you've already said that you're going to be committed to this. We work towards this. And some governments start actually wanting to use those events to show good intention, which is a good step forward. And believe it or not, in the past couple of years, we've had a lot of windows of opportunity, as I call them, where we have a lot of countries who even approached UNESCO saying, look, we want to revise our laws. We want to do this and that. We have a number of examples. We have Sudan. We helped before, now we're doing again. We're revising all the laws now, according to international standards. We're also doing that in Lebanon. There's a media law reform project ongoing. So this is a step forward. Again, it's maybe slow, but we're progressing. And I hope soon we will have more results.
نقول في العربية بأنه نقطة الماء عندما تأتي.
We say in Arabic, when after years you would be able to dismantle a big rock, a huge rock. These are, yes, true, these are little steps, but with the time they would have real action. If anybody who is present here from any country, we have offices across the Arab world. The multi-donor program does not give direct fund to the organizations like Global Defense Fund. Through our offices, our staff members are very understanding understanding, and they do want to support. For example, in Yemen, we have the Doha office. Syria and Lebanon is covered by. In Jordan, we have also another one in Rabat and in Tunisia. We have offices across the Arab region. So go to them. We are planning for the next year funding for projects, next year projects. If your partners or beneficiaries, please go to them, see what's on their minds, even share your ideas about your needs or anything that we can work on. And I'm really honored and pleased to communicate or to connect you with our colleagues in the offices. So these are, this is kind of a network, squares that can work together, that can connect and intermingle. And I have a clip, a 20-minute clip. Evelyn, we talked about figures, shocking figures, and Maali said, yes, you can communicate to develop and improve the journalism. What safety, what are FPU recommendations to enhance this in the Arab region? In less than 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, of course. Well, if I just may add to what Maali just said and what has been said before, I think, we need to focus on what can be done. If we focus too much on, these grim figures, I think, if you look at impunity, for instance, it's not an isolated case. Attacks against journalists are not isolated cases. These people are being attacked because there's a rule of law problem, because there's a good governance problem, because and these are not things that we can solve very easily, very quickly. So there's, I think that's very important to emphasize. And I think there's also a very important thing that we can still be doing. And that's, getting the public to really care about these issues, care about the journalists that are working for them, to telling the stories that matter to them. Because if we can get them more on board, you can create the pressure that's needed to get the change in the end. And that's a long-term thing. But what we do at Free Press Unlimited is much more than only working on impunity, because we also have a big emergency fund for journalists, where we help journalists when they're in trouble, when they've been attacked, when their material has been harmed, or when they need to be relocating. So that's something that we're doing. We have a legal defense fund when journalists are being sued on I would say questionable grounds. And with these investigations and with the People's Tribunal, we try to create this extra demand for justice towards state, because I really agree with Maali that, we can be very pessimistic about the state of the world, and I think for a good reason. But there's also many things we can do to improve it on the longer term. And I think if we work together, and if journalists join us in this effort, then there's a lot that can be improved, I think. Thank you.
شكرا. Thank you, Evelyn. لدينا 3 أسئلة فقط.
Thank you, Evelyn. We have 3 questions only. We have only 10 minutes for 3 questions, please. Actually, Said is telling me we're out of time. Let's just take 3 questions. George Kurzum from Palestine, editor-in-chief of Afaq al-Bia, Environment, Horizons and Development. First, as you all know, the eyes of the authorities, the eyes of the Arab and Palestinian authorities monitor the journalists either directly or indirectly. The majority Arab journalism, including the Palestinian, on this basis are keen not to go beyond the red lines, the government or authority red lines, being concerned about certain procedures that can be taken against them by some government parties or security parties. Many of the decisions, security decisions, many of the arbitrary security government decisions and the so-called decisions by law, random decisions by law, such as the cybercrime loose law that aims to silence the mouth. In fact, this has made a lot of workers or in the journalism sector in the Arab world in general, but I'm trying to be specific in the Palestinian context. Many of the activists and the bloggers in the social media work with concerns and intimidation, they try to have some self-monitoring, and this is very clear and obvious. Our colleague Maali, how can we handle the situation? The other idea quickly, from a legal perspective or a law perspective, the government money spent on security, are they collected? They are collected from the pockets of the public. And legally speaking, these money or such money, the government or servants and the security servants are employees who are taxpayers at the same time. But we notice that expenditure, a big part of this money are spent on security and intelligence activities that have nothing to do with the personal security of individuals or of citizens, including the journalists or the media people. What do you think? What do you think about this approach? Let's take another question. Bakr, please, followed by a woman. I know that everybody wants to make observations. First question, you can only do one question. Okay, to Evelyn. My question is to Evelyn. Since 2000, Israel killed 55 Palestinians. And there has been a delay of accountability for 25 years, even at the International Court of Justice, when Shireen Abu Akleh was killed. Would the crimes against journalists would they be dropped by limitation? And what about the evidence collection, especially that the International Court of Justice needs certain evidence, technically speaking, in order to accept any request regarding such crimes? Thank you. A third question by a woman, please. Good morning. Thank you for this session. Radia Ali, fact checker and journalist from Tunisia. In a nutshell, I have a recommendation. Many laws and conventions, treaties, but activities or practices did not change. How many journalists have to die or to be killed until the world wakes up? I personally recommend that training for the young journalists or for the in order to change the mindsets and the practices. My question about independent journalists, how can they be protected? How can you provide protection to independent ones? Actual education in the schools has been started by the ARIJ since more than 10 years. And are there any universities have or provide courses on journalism safety education? Actually, it's a joint project with UNESCO. There are universities in Iraq, in Lebanon, Palestine, who a number of countries in the past 2 months or in the next 2 months, we will have more meetings with other media people, mainly in Tunisia, to integrate journalism safety practices in the university education. What you have said regarding the independent journalists are the ones that are more vulnerable and are more at risk for two different reasons. The first is that they work independently without support of any media institution, and the other one is that they need to do further steps, more risks to carry out their job. To us, there is an important tool in Morocco. We started with a collective agreement for independent journalists, whereby we can provide protection to those who work independently within a convention or agreement that protects the safety and security and the minimum livelihood of journalists in order to reduce the vulnerability suffered in this sector. Sorry, we're running out of time. Maali, your colleague from Palestine, said that the journalism or the press is concerned about going beyond the red lights. How can you handle this situation?
This is a very, very common phenomena. When journalists do not know enough about the regulations in the country, They sometimes are, there's this effect where they themselves want to avoid getting in trouble, right? There are different components. Number one is making sure that they're aware of what laws are in place. Of course, we have to first look at the laws and regulations and make sure that they are actually according to international standards. But also another component is, for example, with ARIJ, for the clinics. The clinics are also providing legal support, legal advice, right? So the journalist, when he or she is writing a piece, they can go to this legal expert and ask them if there are any issues that he or she would face, be prepared for it if need be, but also identify if he or she could investigate or write or do this or that. So in a sense, they have to, sometimes a lot of journalists do that because they're not aware. So awareness is good about the laws in place. Sometimes you censor yourself because you're not aware. And number two is, of course, working on the laws themselves to make sure they are also according to national standards. And number three, having these legal experts that provide advice and support. Unfortunately, a lot of these regulations and laws are not even there for the public to see. So that's also an issue. So a lot of civil society organizations are also working with UNESCO to put them, to have them for the public to look at. And he also mentioned the issue of the police, right? The same thing, this lack of awareness. Those police officers are not aware of those international conventions that their countries ratified or signed, but also they are not aware of the role of the journalist. He, at the end of the day, he's also a citizen himself, right? Yes. The police officer. So that's why we're working on this advocacy, on working with the police, on working with those who should protect us and actually support the media and the journalists. So again, advocacy is very important. We lightly look at it. We always think of things that are in action, more of training, more of, but it is vital. Mm-hmm. And lastly, you talked about youth, whether in schools and so on. We have the media information literacy at UNESCO. It is a very important program. Youth have to also, and the public, not just youth, have to be also aware of the role of the media, but also to differentiate between what's hate speech, not to practice it, what's disinformation, not to share it. So this is again a very important component, and he's right and she's right. Youth have to also be involved in the
شكرا معالي إيفلين. بأقل من دقيقة واحدة.
Evelyn, in one moment, do crimes against journalists finish by time, end by time, or at The Hague? If at a long time passes, limitation time, is it time limited, the crimes against journalists or not?
No, it is not. I know we're running out of time, but I would say, bringing a case to the ICC, for instance, is possible. You would need to prove that it's widespread and systematic. So it's not only against one journalist, but you mentioned, these number of journalists being killed. This is a really long process, though. There's also really politics involved in it, getting the case to the ICC to be looked at. So in the end, I might be a bit repetitive, but I do believe, if you look at these, there's only 5% of cases worldwide that have been solved. There's in total 20%, but 5% of cases where actually the material perpetrator and the mastermind have been caught. And these are really the result of, the actions that have been taken on the national level. So I would say focus on finding the way to create this demand for justice on the local level, creating the pressure there that would have, I think, the most reason to be optimistic about a result. And I think in the meantime, it's very important you collect the evidence, that you work with, experts to make sure that you have a case file, that when the time comes, you're able to prosecute. Because I do believe we've seen that many times, even 10 years later, a journalist case is being taken up and someone is being held to account. So, yeah, there's reason to be
optimistic. Evelyn Wekestra, مديرة السياسة والمناصرة في FPU. Bedankt voor jouw tijd en hartelijk welkom hier in Amman nog eens keer. معالي حزاز منسق برامج المانحين المتعددين في اليونسكو. أهلا وسهلا فيك. شكرا كثير لوقتك.
Munir Zarour, the director of programs at the ARIJ, and thanks for our colleagues. How many colleagues did they receive the safety training course? How many of you did you study the safety professional safety course? Number is encouraging, and thank you. Thanks a lot. Let's take a group photo, please, there for the speakers. Thank you.